This first book was a book of poetry, and this second book is sort of a verse novel. It's more of a novel than anything else. So, so finally, let me just finish this last part. So we were in. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm not going to run out of video space here. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we got to Rhode Island, and then we moved to Virginia. So we were outside of the DC area around Alexandria, Virginia for many years of my teenage youth. And I was traveling all the time, of course, to different places around the United States, Mexico. Well, Mexico, it's around the United States, right? So I was in Mexico a number of times. I would drive to all kinds of different places. Where I lived, you had to have a car basically to get around, and well, it was we didn't have a whole lot of money, but at least by local standards. But there just wasn't a choice. I remember there was a whole thing about manual and automatic transmission. I'll have to tell you that story, but another time. So then later, as I grew up, I went down to Richmond, Virginia, had a whole bunch of legends happen there, personal legends. So I was there for a number of years for college. Another very famous poet was in that area as well in the past. And then I was in DC for a while working at a gas station. That was an interesting experience. My uncle lived there, so I was living with my uncle. And then I went to New Orleans, was there for a few months, essentially to help out my friend to be her roommate. And we were living, like I said, in that Greek revival sort of columned house or apartment in sort of on the border of the French Quarter in Faubourg Marigny in Nola in the Crescent City. Well, that was really a time. So anyway, a lot of crazy things happened there, and I was already planning to go to China at that point. Part of it had to do with the economic recession of 2008. Part of it was the insufferability of that living situation, not just from the roommate, but also from other people who lived around us in the same building. It was really quite crazy. I'll have to tell you about that. That was really nuts. One of the things I remember was this guy was waving a tiki stick at me. He was putting together some kind of Polynesian themed, Hawaiian themed party, and he was threatening my life with a tiki stick, I recall. So it was pretty stupid, but these things happen. Anyway, it wasn't that I was running away, it was just that I wanted to open up a new chapter. So I found on Craigslist, funnily enough, this really sketchy looking ad for a job in a place called Manzhouli in China, which is in the north on the border with Russia. So I talked to a guy on the phone, again, really sketchy ad and phone number. And the guy had a West African accent. I thought, this guy might be Nigerian. Turned out he was. And he was living and working in this place, Manjoli. And described the job to me, and I thought, I don't know what this is. This has all the sort of this has all the aspects of a scam. But I was young and I took a chance, and I wrapped things up, drove a rental car with all my boxes of papers, that is, of, scraps of papers that I had used to write poetic fragments since my very early youth. Took them all back to my mother's house in Northern Virginia. I only had that car for 24 hours, so it was a real zip all the way up from New Orleans to. This was right after Hurricane Gustav, actually. So yeah, and I gave the rental car back in DC. I threw all the boxes into my mother's house, and then within a day, I had to basically get on a bus, Greyhound bus from Washington D.C. all the way to San Francisco, California. So I crossed the country by bus before. This wasn't anything new really, but it was this time I didn't know when I'd be coming back to the United States. I'd been away before. I'd been to Iceland in 2003 alone, which was my first real trip out abroad by myself. I'd gone with my uncle to England, Scotland, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands because of my uncle is a geologist, and there was a geological conference in Edinburgh in Scotland. So we were there for that, and he invited me along. And my cousin, his son, was going to school in a town called Zwolle in the Netherlands. So we kind of made a side trip there to visit him, and we're in Amsterdam for a while. So this was my first trip abroad, not in my mother's womb. Uh, and then Iceland was my first trip by myself abroad. And then after I graduated high school, I traveled all around Central and South America by myself. My goal was to visit every single mainland country in Central and South America serially, which I did. And then I wrote some poems about that experience, which was partly the purpose. So anyway, I'm now crossing the bus in 2008, about to leave America, this time instead of for a few months, probably for years. So that was a very strange experience, uh, and that's a whole story, that bus ride. But we got to San Francisco. I took a flight from there to Beijing, China, and I arrived in incredibly disabling cold, disarming cold. It was crazy. I arrived, it was, I had been at that point to 30 something countries, I guess. And, some of these countries were some of the poorest in the world, places that were really, well, shocking in a way for someone who, like, though I wasn't terribly privileged growing up by American standards. I mean, at least for the area that we lived in, it would have been different if we lived in Appalachia. But uh, to see that the level of abject poverty up close, it's really it's really something else. So basically, China, though, I guess it's not just about poverty or the abjectness of it. It's more about culture. So somehow, as shocking as much sort of as much culture shock as I experienced in other parts of place in other places I traveled, nothing could have prepared me for China. It was really, I don't know. I'll have to tell you about this some other time because this was truly shocking. I'll have to give you all the descriptions. Anyway, long story short, I was whisked away to some random house by this girl where she and her boyfriend lived, and we were eating uh, Chinese dumplings, or they were anyway. I mean, see, this is the thing. At that time, I was very religious, so I had certain restrictions that applied. I'll have to tell you about that. So then I took a train up north to the cold north. This was really, really crazy. Reminds me of like, well, it was a train journey, so it wasn't quite like Basho on his travel to the deep north. That's a travel writing classic of Japanese literature. You can check that out. uh, Basho was basically the king of haiku. So we'll get into him and others at a later point. So yeah, so I got to Manjoli. I taught there for a year and wrote poetry as well. And it was really quite an insane experience. I became friends with that Nigerian guy that I'd spoken with on the phone when I was in New Orleans, and we're still friends to this day, actually. And this was now, that was 2008, 2009 now. So, he's back in Nigeria since. So it's kind of both left China, but he was there for over a decade, and I was there for a number of years, not a decade, but so after that, he relocated to a city called Shenyang, which is about 4 hours by fast train to Beijing. And he was threatened with his life, though he'd helped set up this school in Manzhouli. Basically, the person who ran the school was this woman who was sort of like a young upstart within that community, and her husband was a kind of local businessman who pretty clearly had connections to the triads or the sort of mafia of China. Mafia is not quite the right term. I'll have to describe triads, or you can look it up as well. Well, just to kind of keep it simple, we'll say it's the mafia of China. So basically, this guy threatened my friend's life, the husband of the owner of the school that we both worked at. And so my friend, the Nigerian, had to flee in the middle of the night to another city so that he wouldn't have his life remain in jeopardy. I continued on there for a week or two, but I also realized that I was guilty by association. Essentially, he had been falsely accused of sleeping with the boss. That's basically the gist of it. So I was obviously his friend. This is the other issue here. I was one of only two foreigners, that is to say, non Chinese, non Russian, who lived in this city. I mean, obviously, we did probably have some Koreans. You did have people, different ethnic groups from around Russia and China, but in terms of like an American or an African, someone from far away, it wasn't well represented, except for one guy we knew of who was Australian, who had married a Chinese woman and was, had settled there. So that was one guy, but he didn't really talk to us. So in any case, I had to also basically run away under cover of night. I had to dress up as a Russian smuggler. You have to understand, this woman, our boss, it was such a small town or city in the middle of the steppes, the grassy steppes. I'll have to describe this to you at some other point in full. She had like old grandmothers and aunties looking out from their windows, spying on her workers, on her teachers, so they would look out their windows. I guess they had nothing better to do, and then they would report back to her on the phone, telling her, "Oh, I just saw foreigner number two walking down such and such street. That's where he is now." So they had a whole military operation. uh, and this boss of ours, she would tell us that, I'll pay you later on, and always telling us that she was going to pay us, and there was always some kind of delay, and then we'd be walking down these wintry streets, my beard iced over, and then we would see her in one of the few fancy restaurants through the front window eating some wonderful meal with the money that supposedly she didn't have to pay us with. So that was a whole thing. I mean, I ended up bringing this. I wrote up a whole legal document which I sent to the local Chinese government, and they almost shut down her school because of the injustices that she committed, which was very unusual. Basically, I wrote this whole sort of folio, I don't know, in legalese, in English, and then I put my Chinese was my spoken Chinese was decent, but I certainly couldn't write a formal legal document in Chinese, so I just used Google Translate circa 2010, and it came out pretty badly, of course, but nonetheless, I posed as my own attorney under a different name, and I sent it to the Neimanggu, or sort of provincial government, uh, the Neimanggu government, or the provincial government of Neimanggu. I think that's the right tone. Anyway, they received it. I was already in a different town. The whole reason I did this, of course, was because in China at the time, in order to go work at another school, you had to have an official form of release from your previous employer. And because I left without notifying her uh, in advance, she was withholding this official release. So it was basically meaning that if I didn't get that formal that release from her, I would be blacklisted from working and from re-entering China. So I already had a job lined up in this new city, and this woman was causing a serious problem for me, saying basically, I'm not going to let you remain in China after what you did. But of course, I'm the kind of person I wouldn't just flee a situation if it wasn't truly dangerous and unjust. I'm a pretty loyal guy. But the thing is that first of all, my friend was threatened with his life, had to flee under the prospect of death, imminent death, by someone you can certainly take it seriously from. I followed in tow a little time later because I was also at risk, and by association. And the other issue, of course, was this woman was guilty of numerous crimes, you could say, taking advantage of another teacher who was there for a short time from Canada who had a heart condition, and this lady was trying to make her jump to entertain the children, and the woman was saying, "But I told you in advance I have heart problems. I can't jump up and down for the kids." So anyway, she we had to help her escape. But anyway, there were so many things withholding money from us, and so I had to leave, really. So I sent this fake legal document to the local government, and in the end, they took it seriously, which was a huge surprise. I can't believe the chutzpah I had in doing that, but it worked. So they nearly shut down her school. She was forced to give me that special letter of release, and I was able to work in the new city and open up a new chapter of my life. So I was there for another year or more, and then I went to South Korea, Japan, came back to China. This was by boat. I took a ferry to both places. And that was a huge dream to go to Japan because I had such an obsession with Japanese poetry since I was a teenager. So that's a whole other chapter to talk about. So then I traveled down through China. I took a unicycle trip. I was a pretty avid unicyclist. I used to unicycle to and from work in Manzhouli over the ice. I remember guys I would pass would go as if they never seen such a thing. It was pretty well. So anyway, I rode my unicycle through Laos, Cambodia, parts of Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore. So essentially, and Burma as well. So basically, it was all in all over 1,000 kilometers ridden on a unicycle. And I was, again, very religious at the time, so I had on all the garb. And I also had a huge pack, 50 pounds, plus a ukulele sticking out. Really crazy image, right? But so when I got to Singapore, I then took a flight. This was after many months of unicycling uh, through jungles and palm plantations. Wow, it was really something. So I got to India. Basically lived in India for about 6 months or so. Then I was in Nepal for a number of months because I was trying to go live in Israel, basically. And I eventually did get to Israel, and that's a whole other chapter. So I'll have to explain some of these other things, but we're basically up to the present, kind of. This was still 2011 by the time I got to Israel, and it's now 2020. So obviously some time has passed. But this was all of these occasions and changes I've described right now are part and parcel of my development as an artist, but primarily as a poet. And I believe that once I start to break down for you in more depth how each of these extraordinary experiences affected my development as a poet, it can also help you to identify in your own life the parts of your life that have been or can be most effective in your development as a poet, artist, scientist, or whatever it is you want to be. To train your eyes on the goal and to use the experiences you've had to maximize your imprint. And don't make light of that. If people say, why would you want to make an imprint on the world? What's the point? Well, there is a point, and I'll have to tell you about why in a while. So you have to see the next video to learn why. But ultimately, give me some likes. I could use your likes. Give me as many likes as countries I've been to for each person. Well, I'm a bit, again, the chutzpah with this guy. So, yeah, just please watch my videos. I really appreciate it. And I've had a lot of fun talking to you guys. Love you all. And let's be in touch. Again, I'm Ben Kenny, signing out.